The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the palace courtyard as Margaret Fletcher clutched her resignation letter with trembling hands. After 23 years of faithful service to the royal household, she never imagined she would be among the dozens of staff members quietly asked to clear their desks by week's end. What she witnessed in the East Wing 3 nights ago had changed everything, and now the very foundations of palace tradition were crumbling beneath a wave of unprecedented change that would shock the nation and redefine the monarchy forever. The whispers had started in the servants' quarters weeks earlier, but no one could have predicted the sweeping transformation that William and Catherine were orchestrating behind closed doors. This wasn't just a simple staff reorganization. It was a complete revolution of how the royal household would operate in the modern age, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the palace walls, touching every corner of British society, and changing the face of the monarchy as the world knew it. The ancient corridors of Kensington Palace had never felt more alive with tension than they did on that crisp October morning. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, walked purposefully through the marble-floored hallways, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished stone as she made her way to the private study where her husband William was already deep in conversation with their most trusted advisors. The weight of the decisions they were about to implement pressed heavily on her shoulders, but there was no turning back now. For months, William and Catherine had been quietly observing the inner workings of their household staff, taking careful notes and conducting discreet interviews with long-serving employees. What they discovered had both shocked and motivated them to take unprecedented action. The palace hierarchy, built on centuries of tradition and rigid protocols, had become a labyrinth of inefficiency, petty politics, and in some cases outright corruption that threatened to undermine everything they hoped to achieve as future monarchs. Margaret Fletcher, head housekeeper for over 2 decades, had been one of the first to notice the subtle changes in the royal couple's behavior. They had begun asking different questions during their weekly staff meetings, inquiring about processes that had never been questioned before, and requesting detailed reports on expenditures that had previously been approved without scrutiny. The princess, in particular, had started making unannounced visits to different departments, speaking directly with junior staff members, and taking notes in a small leather-bound journal that never left her side. The transformation had begun with small, seemingly insignificant changes. Catherine had insisted on interviewing every new hire personally, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. She wanted to understand not just their qualifications, but their vision for modernizing the royal household while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. William, meanwhile, had begun conducting surprise inspections of various departments, often accompanied by efficiency experts from outside consulting firms who specialized in organizational restructuring. The first major shock came when Lady Pemberton, who had served as the couple's private secretary for 5 years, was quietly asked to step down from her position. The official explanation cited a desire for fresh perspectives and new approaches, but those close to the situation knew that Lady Pemberton had been resistant to the changes William and Catherine wanted to implement. She had repeatedly emphasized the importance of maintaining traditional protocols, and had openly questioned some of their more progressive initiatives. James Morrison, the palace's chief financial officer, found himself under increasing scrutiny as William and Catherine demanded detailed breakdowns of every expense, no matter how small. They wanted to know why certain suppliers had been chosen, why specific contracts had been renewed year after year without competitive bidding, and where exactly every pound of their household budget was being allocated. Morrison, who had grown comfortable with the loose oversight of previous years, suddenly found himself having to justify decisions he had never expected to be questioned. The couple's investigation had uncovered a web of relationships and agreements that benefited certain staff members while failing to serve the best interests of the royal household. Some employees had been receiving additional compensation through arrangements with suppliers, others had been approving contracts for services that were either overpriced or unnecessary, and a few had been using their positions to advance their own interests rather than those of the Crown. Catherine had been particularly disturbed by what she learned about the treatment of junior staff members. Many of the younger employees, especially those from diverse backgrounds, had reported feeling excluded from important decisions and opportunities for advancement. The traditional hiring practices had created a system where connections and family backgrounds often mattered more than qualifications and dedication. This discovery had strengthened her resolve to implement sweeping changes that would create a more equitable and efficient organization. The planning for the staff shake-up had taken place in absolute secrecy, with William and Catherine meeting privately in the early morning hours or late at night to discuss their strategy. They knew that any leak of their intentions would create chaos and potentially allow problematic employees to destroy evidence or create obstacles to the changes they wanted to implement. They also understood that the scale of their planned reorganization would send shockwaves throughout the entire royal establishment and beyond. Sir Anthony Matthews, their longtime chief of staff, had initially been skeptical of the couple's plans. He had served 3 generations of royals and had seen various attempts at modernization come and go. However, as William and Catherine presented their detailed findings and comprehensive restructuring plan, he began to understand the necessity and potential benefits of their approach. The evidence of inefficiency and misconduct was simply too overwhelming to ignore. The couple had also consulted with leading experts in organizational psychology and change management to ensure that their approach would be both effective and humane. They didn't want to simply fire people arbitrarily. They wanted to create an opportunity for those who were willing to embrace change to grow and thrive in the new structure, while identifying and removing those who were actively working against the household's best interests. As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself reflecting on the conversation she had had with her children the night before. Prince George, now old enough to understand some of the complexities of royal life, had asked why his parents seemed so serious lately. Catherine had explained, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes leaders had to make difficult decisions to ensure that their organization could serve people better. She wanted her children to understand that leadership sometimes required courage to challenge existing systems, even when those changes might be unpopular. The security implications of the staff changes had also been carefully considered. William and Catherine understood that removing long-serving staff members could potentially create security vulnerabilities if those individuals felt betrayed or sought revenge. They had worked closely with their protection officers to identify any potential risks and to ensure that sensitive information would remain secure throughout the transition process. Outside the palace walls, rumours had begun to circulate among the London social circles that something significant was happening within the royal household. Several long-time suppliers had reported unusual requests for information about their contracts and services, and some had even been asked to participate in competitive bidding processes for services they had provided exclusively for years. These developments had created a buzz of speculation about possible changes in royal operations. The media had also begun to take notice of subtle changes in the royal couple's public engagements. William and Catherine had started highlighting organizations and initiatives focused on workplace efficiency, fair employment practices, and organizational transparency. While these interests might have seemed natural given their broader charitable focus, experienced royal watchers recognized that the royals often used their public appearances to signal their private priorities and concerns. Inside the palace, the tension had become palpable. Staff members who had previously operated with minimal oversight suddenly found themselves being asked to provide detailed explanations for their decisions and actions. Meetings that had once been casual affairs became formal sessions with written records and follow-up requirements. The relaxed atmosphere that had characterized much of the household's operations was being replaced by a more professional and accountable environment. Margaret Fletcher had tried to adapt to the changing expectations, but she found herself struggling with the new level of scrutiny and documentation required for even routine decisions. She had built her career on personal relationships and informal agreements, and the move toward formalized processes and transparent decision-making felt foreign and threatening to her established way of working. The couple's determination to implement these changes had been strengthened by their observations of other successful organizations that had undergone similar transformations. They had studied case studies of companies and institutions that had managed to preserve their core values and traditions while adapting their operations to meet modern standards of efficiency and accountability. These examples had given them confidence that their vision for the royal household was not only necessary but achievable. As Catherine entered the study where William was waiting, she carried with her a folder containing the final list of staff changes that would be announced within the next 48 hours. The decisions had been carefully considered and thoroughly documented, with detailed explanations for each personnel change and clear plans for ensuring continuity of operations during the transition period. The time for planning and preparation was ending, and the time for action was about to begin. The transformation they were about to unleash would challenge every assumption about how the royal household should operate, and would establish new standards for transparency, efficiency, and fairness that would influence royal operations for generations to come. But first, they had to navigate the immediate aftermath of decisions that would affect dozens of lives and potentially reshape the public's perception of the modern monarchy. The clock in William's study chimed 8 times as he closed the leather portfolio containing what would become known as the most comprehensive reorganization in royal household history. Catherine sat across from him, her expression reflecting the gravity of what they were about to set in motion. In less than 2 hours, they would begin the process of personally meeting with each affected staff member. a decision that had surprised even their closest advisors, who had suggested that such conversations should be delegated to department heads. Sir Anthony Matthews entered the room carrying a steaming cup of tea and a grim expression. He had spent the previous evening reviewing the legal implications of each personnel change, ensuring that every dismissal, transfer, and role modification would be conducted in full compliance with employment law and royal protocols. The complexity of the task had kept him awake most of the night, but he was confident that their approach would withstand any legal challenges that might arise. The first meeting was scheduled with Margaret Fletcher, whose 23 years of service had earned her the courtesy of a personal explanation from the royal couple themselves. Catherine had insisted on this approach, believing that long-time employees deserved to hear directly from them about the reasons for their departure and the appreciation for their years of dedicated service. It was a gesture that went far beyond traditional royal protocols and reflected the couple's commitment to treating their staff with dignity throughout the transition. At precisely 9 o'clock, Margaret knocked on the study door and entered to find both William and Catherine seated at the round table they typically used for informal meetings. The setting was intended to feel less intimidating than if they had positioned themselves behind William's imposing desk, but Margaret immediately sensed the serious nature of the conversation from their expressions and formal posture. William began by acknowledging Margaret's long service and expressing genuine gratitude for her dedication to the household. He spoke about specific instances where her attention to detail and commitment to excellence had been particularly valuable, making it clear that their decision was not based on dissatisfaction with her work quality. Catherine then took over, explaining their vision for modernizing the household operations and the need for different skill sets and approaches to meet the challenges of contemporary royal life. The conversation that followed was both difficult and revealing. Margaret expressed her shock at being asked to leave, noting that she had expected to retire from royal service in a few years' time. She questioned whether the changes were really necessary and worried that the traditions and standards she had worked to maintain would be lost in the pursuit of modernization. Her emotional response was exactly what William and Catherine had expected, and they had prepared carefully for how to address her concerns with empathy while remaining firm in their decision. Catherine explained that they were not dismissing the value of tradition, but rather seeking to preserve what was truly important while eliminating practices that had become outdated or inefficient. She shared specific examples of situations where traditional approaches had created problems or missed opportunities, helping Margaret understand that the changes were driven by practical necessity rather than arbitrary preference for novelty. The discussion of Margaret's departure package took nearly an hour, as William and Catherine wanted to ensure that she would be financially secure and professionally recognized for her years of service. They had prepared a comprehensive severance package that exceeded standard requirements and included assistance with finding new employment if she desired to continue working. They also offered to provide positive references that would highlight her strengths and contributions to the royal household. After Margaret left the study, clearly emotional but seemingly accepting of their decision, William and Catherine took a brief break to prepare for their next meeting. They reviewed their notes about James Morrison, the chief financial officer, whose oversight failures had contributed significantly to the problems they had discovered. Morrison's case was more complex because his dismissal was based on performance issues rather than simply organizational restructuring. Morrison entered the study with a confidence that quickly evaporated when he realized the serious nature of the meeting. William presented a detailed summary of the financial irregularities and questionable decisions that had come to light during their investigation. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, including documentation of unauthorized payments, inflated contracts, and failure to follow established procurement procedures. Catherine focused on the impact these financial management failures had on the household's ability to fulfill its responsibilities effectively. She explained how the overspending in certain areas had forced cutbacks in other important programs and had created inefficiencies that ultimately served no one well. Her approach was professional rather than accusatory, but the message was clear that Morrison's performance had fallen far short of acceptable standards. Morrison's response revealed both his awareness of the problems and his unwillingness to take full responsibility for them. He attempted to blame various circumstances and other individuals for the failures, while minimizing his role in decisions that had clear documentation of his approval and involvement. This defensive reaction only reinforced William and Catherine's conclusion that he was not capable of providing the leadership and accountability they needed in such a critical position. The conversation with Morrison lasted longer than anticipated because of his attempts to negotiate different terms for his departure. He seemed to believe that his long service and knowledge of royal financial operations would make his dismissal too disruptive to implement. However, William and Catherine had already identified his replacement and had developed detailed transition plans that would ensure continuity while implementing much stronger oversight and accountability measures. The rest of the morning continued with similar meetings, each tailored to the specific circumstances of the individual staff member and the reasons for their departure or reassignment. Some conversations were more amicable than others, but William and Catherine maintained their commitment to treating each person with respect, while being clear about their expectations and decisions. Lady Pemberton's meeting was particularly challenging because she had been personally recruited by Catherine several years earlier and had developed what she considered to be a close working relationship with both royals. Her resistance to the modernization efforts had been subtle but persistent, often taking the form of expressing concerns about maintaining proper protocols or questioning whether certain changes were appropriate for royal standards. Catherine took the lead in explaining to Lady Pemberton that their vision for the future of the royal household required different approaches to communication, public engagement, and operational efficiency. She acknowledged Lady Pemberton's expertise in traditional protocols while making it clear that they needed someone who could help them balance respect for tradition with the need to connect with contemporary audiences and address modern challenges. The afternoon brought meetings with several junior staff members who were being promoted or given expanded responsibilities as part of the reorganization. These conversations were much more positive, as William and Catherine explained their confidence in these individuals' abilities and their vision for how different departments would operate under new leadership. They took time to understand each person's career goals and to ensure that the new roles would provide opportunities for professional growth and development. Sarah Chen, a relatively junior member of the communications team, was surprised to learn that she was being promoted to Deputy Communications Director with significant new responsibilities. She had demonstrated creativity and cultural sensitivity in her previous work, and William and Catherine believed she could help them connect more effectively with younger and more diverse audiences. Her promotion was also symbolic of their commitment to advancing talented individuals based on merit, rather than seniority or connections. The couple also met with representatives from the departments that would be most affected by the changes, including security, communications, and household management. These meetings focused on ensuring that the transitions would be smooth and that essential operations would continue without interruption during the personnel changes. The department heads had been preparing for these changes for several weeks, working closely with Sir Anthony Matthews to develop implementation plans. As the day progressed, word of the meetings began to spread throughout the palace, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and speculation among staff members who had not yet been called to meet with the royal couple. Some employees gathered in small groups to discuss what they knew or had heard, while others tried to continue with their normal duties despite the obvious tension and disruption. The security team had been briefed on the situation and was prepared to handle any potential problems that might arise from disgruntled former employees. While they didn't expect any serious issues, they understood that significant personnel changes could create unpredictable reactions and wanted to ensure that all protocols were in place to protect both the royal family and the remaining staff members. By late afternoon, William and Catherine had completed the most difficult conversations and were meeting with their senior advisors to review the day's events and prepare for the public announcement that would be made the following morning. They had decided to be proactive in communicating about the changes rather than allowing speculation and rumors to fill the information vacuum. The couple felt emotionally drained but satisfied that they had handled the personal conversations with the dignity and respect that their staff members deserved. They had listened to concerns, answered questions, and provided clear explanations for their decisions, while remaining firm about the necessity of the changes they were implementing. The evening would be spent finalizing the public statement about the staff reorganization and preparing for what they expected to be intense media scrutiny and public debate about their decisions. They understood that their approach to managing the royal household would be seen as an indication of how they would approach their broader responsibilities as future monarchs, making it essential that they communicate their vision and reasoning clearly and effectively. The morning headlines were more explosive than even William and Catherine's most pessimistic advisors had predicted. "Payless purge," screamed the tabloids, while more respected publications opted for phrases like "royal household revolution" and "unprecedented palace shake-up." The couple's carefully worded statement about modernizing operations while maintaining core values had been overshadowed by leaked details from former employees who were eager to share their versions of events with eager journalists. Margaret Fletcher had spent the evening after her dismissal on the phone with a reporter from one of the most sensationalistic newspapers, describing what she characterized as a cold and calculated destruction of palace traditions. Her quotes, printed prominently on the front page, painted William and Catherine as ruthless modernizers who had no respect for the dedicated service of long-time employees or the time-honored practices that had served the monarchy for generations. The breakfast table in the private dining room at Kensington Palace was covered with newspapers from across the political spectrum, each offering its own interpretation of the staff changes. Catherine read through the coverage while William handled phone calls from various palace officials who were dealing with media inquiries and requests for additional information. The volume and intensity of the coverage had exceeded all their expectations, turning what they had hoped would be viewed as responsible management into a full-blown controversy. Sir Anthony Matthews entered the dining room with a grim expression and a folder full of additional problems that had emerged overnight. 3 more former employees had given interviews to different media outlets, and while their accounts varied in detail, they all painted a picture of a royal couple who had lost touch with the human cost of their decisions. The narrative that was emerging in the press focused heavily on the emotional impact on long-time servants rather than the operational improvements the changes were intended to achieve. The most damaging story had come from James Morrison, the former chief financial officer, who had provided a detailed account of his dismissal that conveniently omitted any mention of the financial irregularities that had led to his departure. Instead, he portrayed himself as a victim of unreasonable expectations and modernization efforts that prioritized efficiency over the personal relationships that had traditionally characterized royal household operations. Catherine felt a deep frustration as she read Morrison's characterization of their meeting, which bore little resemblance to the actual conversation they had shared. His version painted her as cold and dismissive, while portraying William as someone who had been influenced by outside consultants to abandon the wisdom of experienced palace staff. The distortion of their careful and respectful approach to the personnel changes was particularly galling because they had worked so hard to treat each affected employee with dignity. The political implications of the controversy were becoming apparent as well. Several members of Parliament had issued statements questioning whether the royal couple's management style was appropriate for their future roles as head of state. Opposition politicians were using the situation to raise broader questions about the monarchy's relevance and accountability, while supporters were finding themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending personnel decisions they knew little about. The couple's private secretary, one of the few senior staff members who had retained their position, brought news that several scheduled public appearances for the coming week would need to be reconsidered given the media attention surrounding the staff changes. The concern was that public events would be dominated by questions about the palace controversy, rather than the charitable causes and community initiatives they were intended to highlight. William and Catherine spent the morning in crisis management mode, working with their communications team to develop responses to the most serious allegations while trying to maintain their focus on the long-term goals that had motivated the restructuring in the first place. They were particularly concerned about correcting factual inaccuracies in the media coverage without appearing defensive or getting drawn into public disputes with former employees. The couple's children were being kept informed about the situation in age-appropriate ways, as they would inevitably hear about the controversy from classmates or see references to it in media coverage. Catherine was especially concerned about ensuring that Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis understood that their parents had made these difficult decisions based on their responsibility to manage their household effectively and fairly. By midday, the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from journalists seeking additional information, former employees offering to share their stories, and members of the public expressing both support and criticism for the royal couple's actions. The communications team had prepared standard responses to the most common inquiries, but the sheer volume of interest was straining their resources and creating additional stress for remaining staff members. Lady Pemberton's interview, published in the afternoon edition of a respected broadsheet newspaper, provided a more nuanced but equally critical perspective on the staff changes. She described William and Catherine as well-intentioned but naive about the complexities of royal protocol and the importance of institutional knowledge. Her portrayal suggested that the couple had been misled by outside consultants who didn't understand the unique requirements of royal household operations. The article included Lady Pemberton's concerns about the loss of experienced staff who understood the subtleties of royal etiquette and protocol that couldn't be easily taught to replacements. She worried that the emphasis on modernization and efficiency would lead to mistakes in ceremonial events and diplomatic situations where traditional approaches had proven their value over time. Catherine found Lady Pemberton's criticism particularly difficult to address because it contained elements of legitimate concern mixed with resistance to necessary change. The challenge was acknowledging the value of experience and institutional knowledge while explaining why some traditional practices had become obstacles to effective operation rather than assets to be preserved. The couple's afternoon was spent in meetings with department heads and remaining senior staff members who were working to maintain normal operations while dealing with the disruption caused by the personnel changes and media attention. The goal was to demonstrate that the household could continue to function effectively despite the controversy, and that the changes would ultimately improve their ability to serve both the royal family and the public. Sarah Chen, the newly promoted Deputy Communications Director, found herself thrust into a challenging situation as she worked to coordinate responses to media inquiries while learning her expanded responsibilities. Her promotion had been mentioned in some of the media coverage as an example of the couple's commitment to advancing talented younger staff members, but it also meant she was under intense scrutiny as a symbol of their new approach. The security team reported increased activity around the palace perimeter as journalists and photographers sought to capture images that might provide additional context for their stories about the staff changes. While there were no serious security concerns, the heightened media attention was creating additional stress for everyone living and working within the palace grounds. William received a call from his father expressing concern about the negative media coverage and its potential impact on the broader royal family's reputation. The conversation was supportive but included suggestions about how the situation might be managed more effectively, including the possibility of scaling back some of the planned changes or providing additional public explanations for the decisions that had been made. The couple also heard from various members of the extended royal family, charitable organizations they supported, and personal friends who were offering advice and support during what they recognized as a difficult period. The overwhelming message was that most people who knew them well understood their good intentions, even if they had concerns about the execution or timing of the changes. As the afternoon progressed, William and Catherine began to see some more balanced coverage emerging from journalists who had taken time to investigate the background of the staff changes, rather than simply reporting the immediate reactions of affected employees. These articles provided more context about the operational challenges that had motivated the restructuring and included perspectives from current staff members who supported the changes. One particularly insightful analysis pointed out that other major institutions, including corporations and non-profit organizations, regularly underwent similar reorganizations without generating significant controversy. The piece suggested that the intense scrutiny of the royal household changes reflected both the public's fascination with palace operations and unrealistic expectations about how such organizations should be managed. The evening brought the couple's first opportunity to step back and reflect on the events of the day. They remained convinced that their decisions had been necessary and appropriate, but they also recognized that they had underestimated the emotional impact of the changes on both affected employees and the broader public. The challenge now was to continue implementing their vision for modernization while addressing legitimate concerns and managing the ongoing controversy. Catherine spent time that evening reviewing letters and emails from members of the public who had taken the time to write about their reactions to the staff changes. While many were critical, there were also messages of support from people who appreciated their efforts to bring greater accountability and efficiency to royal operations. These communications helped reinforce her belief that their actions, while difficult, were ultimately in the best interests of the institution they served. The couple's evening meeting with their senior advisors focused on developing strategies for the coming days and weeks as they continued to implement the staff changes while managing the public relations challenges. They knew that the initial wave of media attention would eventually subside, but they also understood that their handling of this situation would influence public perceptions of their leadership capabilities for years to come. 3 weeks after the initial announcement, the staff reorganization had evolved from a media sensation into a more complex and nuanced public discussion about the future of the monarchy. William and Catherine had weathered the initial storm of criticism, but they now faced the more challenging task of proving that their controversial decisions would actually produce the improvements they had promised. The palace had settled into a new rhythm, with fresh faces in key positions and a decidedly different atmosphere throughout the corridors that had once been dominated by decades-old routines and relationships. Sarah Chen had emerged as one of the most visible symbols of the couple's new approach, and her performance in the Deputy Communications Director role was being closely watched by both supporters and critics of the staff changes. Her first major test had come during a significant charitable event where she coordinated media coverage and public messaging with a level of creativity and cultural awareness that had impressed even skeptical observers. Her success was particularly meaningful because it demonstrated that the couple's faith in promoting talented younger staff members was justified. The financial management improvements that had motivated James Morrison's dismissal were beginning to show tangible results. The new chief financial officer, recruited from a major charitable organization, had implemented strict oversight procedures and competitive bidding processes that had already identified significant cost savings. These operational improvements were exactly what William and Catherine had hoped to achieve, but they received little media attention compared to the ongoing personal dramas of displaced employees. Margaret Fletcher had found new employment with a wealthy family who appreciated her experience and attention to detail, but she continued to give occasional interviews about her time at the palace. Her perspective had evolved somewhat over the weeks, and while she remained critical of how the changes were implemented, she had begun to acknowledge that some modernization may have been necessary. Her more measured comments helped shift the narrative away from the initial characterizations of the royal couple as heartless modernizers. The couple's public appearances during this period were carefully managed to demonstrate both continuity with royal traditions and their commitment to effective modern leadership. Catherine's visit to a youth employment center included discussions about the importance of organizations adapting to meet changing needs while maintaining their core mission. Her comments were seen as a subtle defense of the palace reorganization without directly addressing the controversy. William's speech at a business leadership conference focused on the challenges facing all institutions in the 21st century and the need for leaders to make difficult decisions in order to serve their stakeholders effectively. His remarks about the importance of accountability and transparency in organizational management were widely interpreted as references to the staff changes, but they were delivered in a context that emphasized broader leadership principles rather than specific palace issues. The couple had also begun to receive unexpected support from former royal staff members who had not been directly affected by the recent changes but who had witnessed the operational problems that motivated the restructuring. Several retired employees provided interviews to more serious publications describing inefficiencies and questionable practices they had observed during their own service. These accounts provided important context for understanding why such dramatic changes had been necessary. One particularly influential article featured comments from a former private secretary who had left royal service several years earlier due to frustration with resistance to modernization efforts. Her account described a system where good ideas were often blocked by senior staff members who were more concerned with preserving their own authority than with improving operations. Her perspective helped explain why William and Catherine had concluded that gradual reform would be insufficient to address systemic problems. The parliamentary questions that had initially focused on criticizing the staff changes gradually shifted toward more constructive discussions about accountability and transparency in royal household operations. Some members of parliament began to express support for the couple's efforts to bring their operations in line with best practices, followed by other major institutions. This evolution in political discourse reflected a growing recognition that the changes, while dramatic, were based on legitimate operational concerns. The couple's relationship with the broader royal family had also stabilized after some initial tensions about the negative publicity generated by the staff changes. Senior royals who had initially worried about the impact on the monarchy's reputation began to see evidence that the reforms were producing real improvements in efficiency and effectiveness. The king's public comments during a state dinner subtly endorsed his son and daughter-in-law's commitment to responsible stewardship of their household operations. International media coverage of the staff changes had initially been critical, but foreign observers began to express admiration for William and Catherine's willingness to take on entrenched interests in order to improve their operations. Several European royal households reached out privately to learn more about their approach, recognizing that many of the challenges they had addressed were common to royal institutions across the continent. The couple's charitable work continued to receive positive attention, and their supporters pointed out that the operational improvements resulting from the staff changes were enabling them to be more effective in their public roles. The streamlined communications processes were helping them reach broader audiences, while the improved financial management was allowing them to support more causes and make better use of their resources. Catherine had begun working with a small team to document the lessons learned from the reorganization process, recognizing that their experience could provide valuable insights for other organizations facing similar challenges. Her notes focused particularly on the importance of clear communication during periods of change and the need to balance respect for tradition with requirements for modernization. The new staff members who had been hired or promoted as part of the reorganization were beginning to demonstrate the different approaches and perspectives that William and Catherine had sought. The household's social media presence had become more engaging and authentic, while their event planning had incorporated innovative elements that appealed to younger audiences without sacrificing the dignity expected of royal occasions. Security assessments of the personnel changes had concluded that the transition had been managed effectively without creating any significant vulnerabilities. The concerns about potential problems from disgruntled former employees had proven largely unfounded, as most of those who had been dismissed had moved on to other opportunities and were not seeking to cause additional difficulties for the royal household. The couple's children had adapted well to the changes in household staffing and had seemed to appreciate the more relaxed and efficient atmosphere that characterized palace operations under the new structure. Their interactions with staff members reflected the same values of respect and accountability that their parents were trying to instill throughout the organization. Public opinion polling conducted several weeks after the initial controversy showed a more nuanced picture than the dramatic headlines had suggested. While there was still criticism of how some aspects of the changes had been handled, there was also growing recognition that modernization efforts were necessary and appropriate. Younger respondents in particular expressed support for the couple's willingness to challenge traditional practices that were no longer serving their intended purposes. The financial audit that had been initiated as part of the reorganization was nearing completion, and preliminary findings suggested that the couple's concerns about fiscal management had been well-founded. The audit had identified several areas where improved oversight and competitive procurement processes could generate significant savings that could be redirected toward charitable activities and public engagement programs. William and Catherine's evening discussions during this period focused increasingly on the long-term implications of their actions rather than the immediate controversies they had generated. They were beginning to see evidence that their approach to household management was being viewed as an indication of how they would handle their broader responsibilities as future monarchs, which added additional significance to the success or failure of their reforms. The couple had also begun to receive invitations to speak at conferences and events focused on organizational leadership and institutional reform. These opportunities represented a chance to share their experiences and insights with leaders facing similar challenges in other contexts, while also demonstrating their expertise in management and modernization. As the month progressed, the staff changes that had initially seemed so controversial were beginning to be viewed as part of a broader pattern of thoughtful leadership and institutional stewardship. The couple's willingness to make difficult decisions in order to improve their operations was being recognized as a sign of maturity and responsibility, rather than reckless modernization. The palace atmosphere had noticeably improved as the new organizational structure took hold, and staff members adapted to clearer expectations and more efficient processes. The combination of experienced professionals who embraced change with talented newcomers who brought fresh perspectives had created a dynamic that was energizing for everyone involved in the royal household's operations. 6 months after the dramatic staff reorganization that had shaken the foundations of royal household operations, William and Catherine stood in the same study where they had planned the controversial changes, reviewing a comprehensive report that documented the transformation's remarkable success. The metrics were impressive. Operational costs had decreased by 18%, while public engagement had increased by over 30%. More importantly, employee satisfaction surveys showed that remaining staff members felt more valued, better supported, and clearer about their roles and responsibilities than at any point in recent palace history. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated a workplace that bore little resemblance to the hierarchical, tradition-bound institution that had existed just months earlier. The corridors buzzed with purposeful activity as staff members from diverse backgrounds worked collaboratively on projects that would have been unimaginable under the previous system. The rigid departmental boundaries that had once created silos and inefficiencies had been replaced by flexible teams that formed and reformed based on the specific requirements of different initiatives and events. Sarah Chen had exceeded every expectation in her expanded role as Deputy Communications Director, transforming not only how the palace communicated with the public, but also how it understood and responded to changing social dynamics. Her innovative use of digital platforms had helped William and Catherine connect with audiences that had previously felt disconnected from royal activities, while her strategic approach to traditional media had enhanced their credibility with established outlets. Her success had become a powerful symbol of the couple's commitment to promoting talent based on merit rather than seniority or connections. The financial reforms implemented after James Morrison's departure had produced even more dramatic improvements than anyone had anticipated. The new chief financial officer had not only eliminated the wasteful spending and questionable arrangements that had previously drained resources, but had also identified new revenue opportunities through more strategic partnerships and more efficient use of palace facilities. The savings had been reinvested in expanded charitable programs and enhanced public services that directly supported the couple's broader mission. Catherine had become increasingly recognized as a thoughtful leader, whose approach to organizational change balanced respect for valuable traditions with the courage to eliminate practices that no longer served their intended purposes. Her detailed documentation of the reorganization process had been requested by leadership consultants working with other major institutions, and she had begun accepting invitations to speak at conferences focused on institutional reform and change management. The couple's children had thrived in the new palace environment, benefiting from interactions with staff members who reflected the diversity of contemporary British society while maintaining the highest standards of professionalism and dedication. Prince George had particularly enjoyed conversations with the new head of security, a former military officer whose background differed significantly from traditional palace appointments, but whose expertise was exactly what modern royal protection required. William's leadership during the crisis had earned him recognition as a future monarch who would not be constrained by outdated practices or resistant to necessary changes. His willingness to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience had impressed both supporters and critics, establishing his reputation as someone who would prioritize effectiveness over ease. Political leaders from across the spectrum had privately expressed admiration for his approach, even when they had publicly criticized specific aspects of the staff changes. The broader royal family had come to recognize the staff reorganization as a watershed moment that had strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's position. The king had publicly praised his son and daughter-in-law's commitment to responsible stewardship, noting that their actions demonstrated the kind of thoughtful leadership the country needed in its future monarchs. Other senior royals had begun implementing similar reforms in their own households, creating a ripple effect of modernization throughout the royal establishment. International recognition of the couple's achievement had grown steadily as the positive results became apparent. Royal households in other countries had requested consultations about their approach to balancing tradition with modernization, while Republican critics who had initially seized on the controversy as evidence of royal dysfunction were forced to acknowledge the improvements in efficiency and accountability that had resulted from the changes. The media narrative had completed a remarkable transformation from initial skepticism to grudging admiration to genuine respect for the couple's vision and execution. Even publications that had been harshly critical during the initial controversy had published follow-up articles acknowledging that the staff changes had produced the improvements that William and Catherine had promised. Editorial writers who had questioned their judgment were now praising their courage and effectiveness as organizational leaders. Margaret Fletcher had requested a private meeting with Catherine to express her evolved perspective on the staff changes and to acknowledge that her initial reaction had been influenced more by personal disappointment than by objective assessment of the palace's needs. During their conversation, she admitted that she had observed many of the problems that had motivated the reorganization, but had been reluctant to challenge established practices or relationships. Her gracious acknowledgement of the positive changes had helped close one of the most painful chapters of the entire experience. The new staff members who had been recruited or promoted as part of the reorganization had formed a cohesive team that embodied the values and approaches William and Catherine had hoped to instill throughout the palace. Their enthusiasm and competence had inspired remaining long-time employees to embrace change rather than resist it, creating a positive feedback loop that had accelerated the transformation process beyond all expectations. The couple's public appearances had taken on a different quality as well, reflecting the increased confidence and efficiency of their support team. Events were better organized, messaging was more consistent and effective, and their ability to connect with diverse audiences had improved dramatically. The operational improvements had translated directly into enhanced public service, justifying the difficult decisions that had made such progress possible. The financial audit that had been completed several months after the staff changes had vindicated every aspect of William and Catherine's assessment of the previous management problems. The documented savings and improved accountability measures had provided objective evidence that the reorganization had been based on solid analysis rather than arbitrary preferences for change. The audit report had become a valuable resource for other organizations considering similar reforms. Catherine's evening reflections often returned to the lessons learned during the most challenging period of the reorganization. She had discovered that effective leadership sometimes required accepting short-term criticism in order to achieve long-term improvements, and that the courage to make difficult decisions was often rewarded with better outcomes for everyone involved. These insights had strengthened her confidence in her own judgment and had prepared her for future challenges that would require similar decisiveness. The palace's enhanced reputation for efficiency and innovation had attracted a higher caliber of job applicants, creating opportunities to continue improving the quality of the staff while maintaining the momentum of positive change. The contrast with the previous situation, where positions were often filled based on connections rather than qualifications, had made recruitment and retention significantly easier and more effective. William and Catherine's relationship had been strengthened by successfully navigating the crisis together, and their partnership had become a model for how couples could support each other through difficult professional challenges. Their ability to maintain their commitment to their principles while adapting their tactics based on experience had demonstrated a maturity that served them well in all aspects of their roles. The couple had also begun to see their experience as a template for approaching other challenges they would face as their responsibilities expanded. The skills they had developed in managing institutional change, communicating during crises, and building consensus around difficult decisions would be invaluable as they took on broader leadership roles within the monarchy and British society. As they looked toward the future, William and Catherine understood that the staff reorganization had been more than just an administrative reform. It had been a declaration of their vision for modern royal leadership and their willingness to take personal risks in order to serve the public interest more effectively. The success of their approach had established them as leaders who could be trusted to make tough decisions and follow through on their commitments. The transformation of their household operations had created a foundation for the kind of monarchy they hoped to lead in the years and decades ahead. By proving that they could successfully manage change while respecting valuable traditions, they had demonstrated their readiness for the greater responsibilities and more complex challenges that awaited them as future monarchs. The staff changes that had once seemed so controversial now appeared to have been not just necessary, but inevitable. Steps in the evolution of a royal household that would serve both the family and the nation more effectively in the 21st century. The courage to act on their convictions had been rewarded with results that exceeded their most optimistic expectations, creating a legacy of effective leadership that would influence royal operations for generations to come.